Hey everybody, this is Perch, and there's an article about this, and I've gotten a couple questions about it, kind of from coming at different angles. So we're going to combine them all together. So there's this thing called the crisis, and DC has had crises for quite some time. We're going to go kind of through some of those, and it would actually be a cool kind of retrospective if we walk through all the crises. So we'll do that too at some point. But the questions arose more frequently after the recent August DC solicitations, where this comic Infinite Frontier, which is a limited series, basically in the solicitation has this line: all the damage from all the crises was undone. Everything was put back to where it belonged, and we do mean everything. Okay. So, as I said, a couple people took note of this. There's been a couple news articles about it. What do they mean by all these crises? And what's interesting is a lot of people reading comics today were not born when the first crisis actually occurred. And so all of this stuff may be a little bit confusing and has been told from different areas. So basically, in 1985, there was a comic called Crisis on Infinite Earths, and it was a DC book. And the reason they did it at the time was kind of twofold. The biggest and primary reason was Marvel was just dominating in the 80s, and DC wanted something to kind of really put themselves on the map. Comics like Secret Wars, which was published not too much earlier, but basically in May of '84, Marvel has this book. It's a huge hit. It's for all the Marvels and the heroes and the villains and this massive threat. And there's a toy crossover and everything else, and so it's seen as very, very popular. DC wanted their own. Thus, in theory, from what has been told, the Crisis on Infinite Earths idea was born. Now, a couple things on this, because sometimes people will say, but there were crises before the Crisis on Infinite Earths, and that's true. There were-ish. What they're referring to there is that for about 20 years or so before Crisis on Infinite Earths, there were a number of stories told in DC Comics, like Crisis on Earth 1, Crisis on Earth 2, The Earth Without a Justice League, a Crisis on Earth A. And basically, this was... I somehow doubt in the 60s that DC was setting up this concept of a crisis as an event thing. It was just a word that was flashy and was being used, and it was the story title in a lot of cases. But it became something that kind of stuck with the brand as they used it over and over again, in particular as they used it to describe their multiverse. It kind of became shorthand for, shenanigans are happening with the various Earths, and the multiverse is in danger. And so, problems are here, and they're big problems that could destroy the entire universe or multiverse or any of that. A lot of these crises happened in, certainly in some Justice League comics, but also in Legion of Superheroes. But they were doing a lot of these crises. And I mean dozens of stories used this title and kind of highlighted all this. And then there were, this is a bigger crisis than the crisis before. So anyway, all this stuff is going on. And really, it was they were the heroes must band together, often from different worlds, to combat some crazy threat. Was in short, kind of basically what's happening. So Crisis on Infinite Earths comes out, and as I mentioned, they wanted something that was going to get the same kind of headlines, the buzz, help the company like Secret Wars was doing. At the same time, there had been discussions in DC around needing to fix things, and in particular. And this is kind of important as we go, because there had been so many comics over so long a stretch of time, and often continuity was not, quote unquote, protected with an iron fist. Backstories in comics were conflicting and inconsistent at times. The linear flow of time was not accounted for, and power levels would be all over the place, particularly in the 60s. Superman was he was basically given whatever powers he needed to fit the story, and those powers would sometimes be godlike and sometimes more humble. And Superman was often pretty nuts in terms of what he was doing. And then DC got very much in the habit of like wanting to reveal some secret of Superman's past. And the problem is, the more secrets you introduce, the more likelihood that these secrets are going to conflict with each other. The same thing kind of happened with Green Lantern and the Flash in particular, where the origins and the powers, because they were revealing new things. Soon, if you're paying close attention, they don't make sense anymore. And this is not, I've heard people say, well, it was a time when there was shoddy editorial. I mean, you're talking about, 20, 30 decades plus of 20, 30 decades, sorry, 20, 30 years of comics piling up. And it was, it basically, and things were loose. And also, and I think this is the most important part, the editors and the writers were by and large just trying to create entertaining comics. They were not trying to create a giant master coda that everybody must work from. And however, this became a common thing in comic shops and within the comic community, and people were doing newsletters and so on. They would get very fixated on, well, wait a minute, this past conflicts with this past, and what was a niche power over here is a niche power over here. See what I'm doing? I'm irritating all the people that called out my language. Anyway, they basically, it got to this point where there's a lot of fan theories about what's going on. Now, normally, what you would do is you would I think this is what Marvel effectively did. They introduced the no prize, which basically punted on the whole thing to say, don't worry about the continuity. We made a continuity error, but hey, we're not infallible and it doesn't really matter anyway. Let's not worry about it. That was kind of Stan Lee's approach. DC took we need to, we better clean this all up. We can't make errors. That was a mistake, I think. But anyway, so in Crisis of Infinite Earths in 85, DC introduced what they call retroactive continuity. And this was intended to smooth out gaps in the storyline and basically have an answer to all these questions. So basically say, we didn't make a mistake. Here's a way that all these different stories and all these different things can make sense. And there's this concept of infinite universes existing in the same physical space. And so this story was told over here and that story was told over there. And that's what's going on. So, and then this lasted for a while. Unfortunately, this was a problem because once you introduce the concept of, oh, no, there's an answer for everything, then people will start to expect an answer for everything. And so after a short period of time, after about another, few years, you get two things come about. You get one, more stories have come about, and Crisis on Infinite Earths didn't solve anything. And you get fans going, well, wait a minute, I like this one thing that seemingly is erased. So what happened to that thing? And DC's like, well, maybe we can introduce it in some way and find an answer. And so they would proceed with 0 Hour, with Infinite Crisis, and Final Crisis as different events, all kind of intended to spike sales because they were a big event and they were tapping into that Crisis name. By this point, DC had the belief and a correct belief that Crisis as a brand could be something that could actually sell. Simultaneously, they wanted to kind of continue to smooth out these problems. The challenge is the more you smooth out, the more you have to be absolutely perfect with it. And even then, when you've got thousands of comics or tens of thousands of comics, there's going to be inconsistencies and you can't just explain it away. The other problem is not everyone is reading all the comics. So even if you explain things away, some readers are not reading certain things. And so it just becomes even more confusing to people, which is exactly what happened. So eventually, this led Dan Didio to introduce this thing, Flashpoint, which was a Crisis event, even though it didn't have Crisis in the name. And that erased basically time, good going Flash. And they started the New 52. And the New 52 was a huge relaunch. It was successful at the beginning, and it was intending to just forget all that other stuff, basically, to say, instead of trying to fix it or explain it, we're just going to dump all of it and start over. Unfortunately, as it turns out, comic fans were curious, liked some of the stuff that got dumped. So a few years later, they did Convergence, which was kind of to bring a bunch of these elements back together again. And then Scott Snyder did Dark Knight's Metal and Death Metal, which were both also considered Crisis events. And in the last one, Death Metal, Dark Knight's Death Metal, they called it the Anti-Crisis event because the point was it was going to erase and repair all the previous crises. It's too early to say whether it will actually accomplish that or not. The challenge here is that once you've opened the door to saying, no, 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 there's an explanation for all this. And unfortunately, death metal, even though part of its kind of crux and how it came about was to say, everything counts, everything matters, we're repairing the timeline, everybody remembers everything. It still is kind of another, deus ex machina. It's another way to kind of say, no, 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 now everything matters. Whereas the simplest answer a long, long time ago would have been to simply say, hey, don't worry about it. Just don't worry about it. You see things like the linear verse, which was earlier this year, where it's like, well, time just goes very, very slowly. That's how Batman's surviving all these years. And you see Marvel getting into a little bit of this too. The more you worry about these things, the more you worry about why the X-Men are running around in 70s clothes and going to disco, when if that really was happening, they would all be super old now. It doesn't really matter. Yes, there are definitely going to be some fans in comic stores who are going to say, well, wait a minute, technically, if Reed Richards was fighting the Cold War, then he would, in the 60s, the arms race for the moon, he would be dead by now. And you could do fun stories like this life story stuff they've done with Spider-Man and right now Fantastic Four to kind of tap into that. But generally, the fans, the customers, and I can say this from now decades of experience selling them, they don't care. They like to speculate on this stuff. They like to make jokes about it. It's kind of like the joke about, can Mr. Fantastic stretch all of his body? It's a funny thing for people to kind of joke about. It can show up in Mallrats as a bit of comedy, but nobody really wants an answer to that question. They don't need to make a comment, basically explaining you don't need to answer it. You can just let it be kind of a funny thing that the fans get. And I think for a lot of this crisis stuff, did it accomplish the goal with sales? Yeah, a lot of these events sold really well. And so on that basis, maybe that's the most important one, it was a success and good for them. On the basis of, did it help clear up the continuity? No, not even a little bit. It usually made things far more confusing, and over time created a bunch of new kind of things to juggle around, and by and large, that part was a mess. But, again, it didn't really matter. The smartest advice I would give DC, because it's not too late, although it's a little late, is just to call it a day. Just say, hey, we're going to produce entertaining comics, and, do they all make sense and fit together perfectly? Hey, that's the fun of being a comic reader. You tell us. And just leave it to the fans, leave it to the customers, and let it alone. But anyway, that's in effect a little bit of what was going on with Crisis. I'll do these retrospectives of these different crises until we hit Heroes in Crisis, and then I'll just tap out. How's that sound? That sounds fun. Anyway, let me know if you have questions. This is a very quick overview, obviously 10 minutes or so. So, lots of stuff left out. But if you're confused, if you've been wondering what all this stuff is, there you go, a little primer. Thanks for listening.